Tishinakishon Selena. My name is Selena. I am Michif, Otipemswak, and a citizen of the Métis Nation. I'm joining you today, really happy to be joining you today from where I live, near the confluence of Lake Ontario and the Credit River. I'm a guest on these beautiful lands and really grateful to the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and Wendat peoples for welcoming me into their territory. My territory is out in the prairies. Regardless of where you are joining from today, we are gathered on Indigenous lands. We express our gratitude, Nanaskimo in my language, for the lands and waters and their critical connection to the health of all of us. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis are still on this land, and we have many roles, including being caregivers, stewards, and storytellers. We have a jam-packed, awesome event today. In a few minutes, we'll get to hear from the co-authors and the key highlights from this year's Canadian City Parks report, and then have the opportunity to discuss and go deeper. We also really want to hear from you, those of you that have taken time out of your day to join us. So please add questions and comments in the chat throughout the session. For those joining us from Francophone communities, we are offering live interpretation for this webinar. If you would like to take advantage of this offering, please click on the CC button and change the language to French. We have the amazing Jennifer supporting us with interpretation. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be available on the Park People website after the session for your reference and to share with any of your friends and colleagues that couldn't make it today. CCPR would not be possible without the support of our presenting sponsor, the Weston Family Foundation. And I'd like to invite Eliza Mitchell to say a few words, please. Eliza, you might still be muted, or I have
many questions. Am I on now? Good, great. Yes, Eliza Mitchell. I'm a director of the Western Family Foundation. For 60 years, we've been involved in supporting Canadians across Canada. Our mission currently is to support healthy landscapes and healthy people. And of course, those two issues intersect in city parks. And so we've been very proud and pleased to fund the Canadian Cities Park Report for 5 years since its inception. And we look forward to the launch today. And I hope many of you, if you haven't read it already, will have a chance to read it. It's my pleasure to introduce our co-authors of this year's report. We'll share a little bit about them and then pass the floor to them to do a bit of a presentation. First up is Adri Clark. She's a senior project manager specializing in research and policy at Park People and co-author of the annual Canadian City Parks report. She leads Park People's research on encampments and has co-authored reports on the social impacts of parks, factors that elicit a sense of belonging in public space, and more. And then Jake Tobin Garrett is a writer, artist, and public space policy and research consultant whose work has been featured in the Toronto Star, CBC, Chatelaine, Maisonneuve Spacing, and more. He previously worked with Park People as manager of policy and planning for 8 years and continues to work with the organization as a consultant.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Selena and Eliza, for that introduction. It's nice to recognize a lot of familiar names on the call, but for those of you who are new to Park People or just discovering the report for the first time this year, I wanted to start us off with just a little bit of background context before we dive into the findings. So as Eliza mentioned, we launched the first Canadian City Parks report back in 2019. This is our 5th edition. And to give you a quick sense of our methodology, the information that we're sharing with you today comes from 3 main sources. So first, we conducted a survey of municipalities about trends and challenges that they're experiencing. This year, we had 35 participating cities across Canada. And second, and this was a new approach for us this year, we conducted in-depth interviews with park staff at these municipalities. So we met with senior leadership, primarily parks directors and managers, and had hour-long conversations to get a more intimate feel for what's going on behind the scenes in parks departments and sort of surface common challenges. And then to round out all of that municipal data, we also conducted a survey of the public. So we heard from over 2,000 residents of Canadian cities just to understand how they're using parks and changes that they'd like to see prioritized in their park systems moving forward. So through these surveys and conversations, we pulled out 10 key insights based on common themes that emerged. And we're just going to start us off by walking everyone through a high-level overview of these findings before we move into our conversation. So with that, I will turn it over to Jake.
Thanks, Adrienne. Thanks, everyone, for joining. The first insight is perhaps not a surprising one. We know cities across Canada have seen park use explode during the pandemic. But these patterns of use have now kind of solidified into a new baseline of power use for parks. So we're seeing actually a 15% more park use in 2022 than we did in 2020, and that was already elevated park use. And we see this using Google mobility data across Canada. Of course, it's great to see people using parks. We all want people using parks, but it is putting increasing pressure on cities. We've heard from cities that they're dealing with higher maintenance costs. They're dealing with more conflicts between users in parks and more demands for new and better amenities. And city staff indicated to us, in all the cities we talked with, that they're struggling to meet these new demands with the resources that they have. So if this is the new normal, and it seems as though it is in terms of this high use, then cities really need to up their investments, particularly around operating budgets and programming budgets for parks. Next slide, please. So given this growth in use that cities have seen, they've been really focusing on the quantity of parks that they have. So really acquiring land as they grow in population. And that's, of course, critically important. But we also heard that a focus on quality of existing parks is really necessary. So if you have a park nearby, but it doesn't have the amenities that you need or feels run down, maybe and a little unsafe, like you're not going to use that park that much, even though it's right by you. And in fact, the #1 barrier that we found in the public's survey to visiting parks was a lack of appropriate amenities. So city staff told us that the funding mechanisms that they have are often more geared towards new parks and new capital investment in parks than sort of redeveloping existing parks or repairing amenities that are already in parks. And so as cities deal increasingly with aging infrastructure, and 100% of the cities we surveyed said that they were dealing with aging infrastructure as a major concern, we really need to refocus on the quality of parks and direct funding to replacement and maintenance of existing assets in our park system.
Another sort of related challenge that we heard cities are facing is meeting demand for parkland in dense urban areas. And we heard about this especially from municipalities that are transitioning from a more suburban to a more urban form, where this is maybe a newer challenge as they've been historically more focused on greenfield development. So where land is already built up or prohibitively expensive to acquire, cities are looking at new park typologies to enhance the public space network. This includes things like privately owned public spaces, encumbered parkland, so things like parks on top of parking garages, and greenways or linear parks. But we heard that these sort of non-traditional park spaces require really careful policy attention. So for example, we know that privately owned public spaces can come with concerns around access restrictions. If there's, the presence of private security, for example, it tends to feel less inviting or truly public than a regular park. So cities are trying to be thoughtful about some of these social implications. And on sort of like a promising note, we found that as cities intensify, there's this opportunity for parks departments to take advantage of public space that's already sort of municipally owned in the form of streets. So we actually found that 3/4 of city residents said that they support street to park conversions or pedestrianization projects, which is pretty cool to see. But of course, these types of solutions require parks departments to be open to new forms of collaboration and sort of navigate new funding arrangements. For example, exploring collaborative management models with transportation departments. And another thing that we heard is that there's growing interest in naturalization projects. So what we mean by this is sort of projects where cities reintroduce native plantings in place of mowed lawns. And these projects can come with important benefits like enhancing biodiversity and climate resilience. We heard from some cities that naturalized areas also have reduced maintenance needs, which can be sort of a win-win in a context of tight operating budgets. But others actually said that these areas require specialized staff training and ecological monitoring. So a bit of a mixed response in terms of the maintenance needs of these spaces. But one thing that we heard consistently from cities is that there's a real challenge with getting sort of public acceptance and buy-in for these projects because there's still a deeply ingrained expectation for parks to have this more manicured colonial aesthetic. But interestingly, in our own public survey, 92% of city residents said that they support naturalization efforts in parks. A big caveat there, though, is that our survey included language around what naturalization is and what benefits it can offer. So this still suggests, though, that there's strong support for this work when it's coupled with a public education approach.
So almost all cities listed extreme weather damage as a major challenge that they were facing. But we found just 57% of cities agreed that the parks they have were well designed to withstand the impacts of climate change. And just 3% strongly agreed with that statement. So there's clearly a lot of work to do still around climate resilience in parks. It's not to say, of course, that cities aren't doing anything. They're doing a ton of things. And some of the things that we heard most about were increasing green infrastructure like bioswales and rain gardens in parks, using more native and drought-resistant plants and planting palettes, and doing planning work like mapping heat islands to understand where greening is needed most, and sometimes even coupling that with equity-based mapping to understand where investment should happen first in those projects. The sort of issue or challenge that we saw is that a lot of these projects are one-off projects, they're pilot projects or demonstration projects rather than sort of the standard way to build parks. And so there's a huge opportunity, we think, to ensure that all new parks and park redevelopments include climate resilient design measures as kind of a standard way of moving forward in park design. Over 5 years now of doing this report, we've seen a huge increase in discussions of equity, which is great. However, we found in many of the conversations that we were having with city staff that when equity was discussed, it was really kind of centered around this equitable distribution of amenities. So like everyone having a water fountain in their park, rather than a discussion of socioeconomic issues like around gender, race, age, ability, or income. But we also heard a real hunger from park managers and park planners for more data-driven equity responses. So the ability to make decisions about investment based on different socioeconomic indicators. I think the stat was something like 77% of cities said that developing such a tool is a priority in the next year. So definitely thinking about it. Some cities have already developed GIS-based systems for mapping socioeconomic indicators and now use those to make decisions about where to invest in parks. So some early examples we can point to, the tool that was developed in Toronto's parkland strategy uses an income layer when looking at where to invest in new parks, and Vancouver's initiative zones uses also an income layer, but includes sort of the ability to layer in other socioeconomic indicators on top of that. So really powerful tools to get into where investment should go. Creating these tools actually also helps alleviate some of the overwhelm we think that staff are feeling when tasked with addressing inequities And they can also help ensure equity work is embedded in all staff roles and not just falling on a few staff, which we saw can result in burnout and an unfair burden on specific staff members that are in sort of equity roles.
So related to this broader theme of equity, a specific issue that we've been exploring, not just this year, but for the past 3 years of the report, is how parks departments are grappling with houselessness and encampments. We know that this has been a pressing issue, particularly since the start of the pandemic, and that parks departments have been challenged in adopting sort of a human rights-based approach to encampments. We heard in our survey this year that only a quarter of parks departments said that they felt equipped with the knowledge and tools to respond to houselessness. And we heard in our conversations that frontline operations staff are often dealing with really difficult, sort of emotionally heavy situations in their on-the-ground work in parks that they're just not trained for. So in this context where staff are really struggling and feeling ill-equipped to engage with the issue, we often see these sort of harmful displacement-based approaches like encampment evictions or defensive design tend to sort of dominate or be the status quo. But on a positive note, we did notice a bit of a shift this year in our conversations with park staff, where we saw growing recognition that houselessness is not just like a straightforward housing issue, and that it's very multifaceted, and parks departments do have a role to play in collaborative solutions. So I think that's reflected in the stat that 79% of cities said that developing an encampment response strategy is a priority for the next year, which shows that there's at least an intention to move towards more thoughtful and consistent approaches instead of just sort of dealing with these situations on a like ad hoc basis. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. And another thing that we heard is that in this context where there's increased use of parks, there's also competing visions for how parks should be used. It sounds very obvious, but there's so many things you can do in a park. Like you can grow food, you can play sports, you can host events, you can walk your dog, meditate in nature. Plus there are always new uses of parks emerging, like pickleball, for example. And this is all happening in a context of limited space. So cities are really struggling to balance all of these different demands. And we heard that one way cities are addressing this is through looking at ways to design flexible amenities that sort of layer multiple uses, whether that's at different times of day or throughout different seasons. So for example, we can think of tennis courts that are converted to a dog park in the winter. And based on our conversations with city staff, I would say that a challenge is ensuring that there are balanced engagement processes to inform these decisions so that it's not simply the loudest voices who have their needs prioritized in parks. And the stat on the slide I also find is a helpful reminder that these diverse uses of parks, even if they sometimes cause tension, are actually something that people really value. So 80% of city residents said that they appreciate seeing people use parks differently than they do personally.
Community involvement is obviously a huge part of parks, but we found it's also one that's really under-resourced in most cities. So while the majority of cities said to us that they felt that they had strong relationships with community groups, when we surveyed community groups, they did not tell us the same. It was 69% of cities said they felt they had a strong relationship, and 39% of community groups said they had a strong relationship with their city. So it's a bit of a disconnect there. The public survey results that we did showed that there were many barriers to getting involved in parks more, but many of the top ones were linked to a lack of support or a lack of information coming from cities. And this actually gels with data that we got from city staff themselves, which showed that, of course, while they value community involvement and input, they also just don't have the funding to support it properly. In fact, 50% of cities said that operating budget pressures meant a reduction in community programming support. So to build strong community involvement, we need more resources for programming and for that kind of ongoing support to community groups beyond sort of like one-time grants that go towards amenities or capital improvements in parks. I know, hearing all of the complexity and challenges with parks right now, it's not surprising that literally every single staff person we spoke with mentioned something related to burnout or the overwhelming amounts of work that they have on their plate, or not being able to focus on what they want to focus on. The bright spot is that there's a real opportunity to collaborate. We saw with other city departments. Often goals from other departments can be aligned, so projects can be kind of co-led and perhaps even co-funded. One of the things we heard a lot about from folks was about how they were collaborating more and more with their transportation departments or their public work departments, whatever they call it in their own city, which makes sense, of course, given that parks and transportation and public works are all dealing with portfolios of public space. So, for example, we heard about collaborations that included green infrastructure projects that make new green space, but they also help manage stormwater runoff, and they also include some traffic calming ability as well. So cities really need to sort of find more of these kind of overlap spots where resources can be shared between city departments and multiple goals can be achieved at the same time.
Marcy, thanks. Jake and Adri, I was nodding a lot throughout your presentation, including the last point, right? Like you talk about the importance of sharing in between departments, especially with large municipalities, right? So many staff and sharing. Also, the importance of sharing, I think, between cities, right? And this report does a great job of highlighting what's happening across the city. And, one of the calls to action can be for those of us that work in cities like myself to keep connecting with people, because we are all on this path together. All right, I do want to give a shout out just to folks, the chat. There's been lots of comments and questions, and keep them coming. We are going to capture all of the things that you're sharing, because there's some really great nuggets there for park people and beyond. We want to have a little bit of a discussion. So Adri and Jake, I love the theme of this year's report, Surfacing Solutions. We know the challenges. Now let's try and put some action into place to address them. So in your work on this report, what was a key solution that you think all park professionals should be thinking about? Adri, I'll go to you first.
Sure. For me, this is maybe a weird topic to get excited about, but it's Edmonton's work on public washrooms, I think, is a solution everyone should know about. There's been so much conversation around the essential importance of park washrooms since the start of the pandemic, especially when businesses were closed and people lacked access to those indoor spaces. But most cities seem really challenged in implementing a park washroom network that feels at the bare minimum usable or open most of the time, but also safe and accessible. So what Edmonton's doing, and also, sorry, I should also say, in our public survey, we heard that public washrooms are the top amenity that people want to see more of in parks, which makes perfect sense because you just can't stay in a park very long without them. So Edmonton has this really cool washroom attendant program in partnership with a local social enterprise, where they hire folks with lived experience of poverty or houselessness to basically staff public washrooms in specific neighborhoods. And it started as a pilot in 2019, but it's been so successful, in a number of areas, reducing maintenance costs, reduced overdoses, which is really critical, life-saving, improved public perceptions of safety, while also having this added benefit of creating employment opportunities for people. It's actually been so successful that they've expanded it into the library system as well as the public transit washroom network, and Calgary is adopting a pilot based on Edmonton's model. So it's just very, very cool. And it's part of an overarching strategy that Edmonton's working on around public washrooms in the city that's set to be released in the winter. So I just think it highlights this challenge that everyone seems to be grappling with. Here's a city that's actually doing something about it. So I encourage everyone to check out the piece in the report about Edmonton's washrooms.
I like that one
Awesome.
too, because it's also just a really good example of like what we just talked about, which is city departments that have overlapping goals working together to achieve like their own objectives. Like we get great park washrooms and you know, and then we also get like job support and social support for folks as well. So it's just like these win-win opportunities are really great. I really like Brampton's Eco Park scoring system, which is their Eco Park plan is like their naturalization plan. If you haven't looked it up, I think it's a fantastic plan, Eco Park plan. And the scoring system that they developed for the plan is this kind of like staff-led assessment of parks that looks at like natural features in the park. Obviously, it looks at surrounding amenities. So like, are they close to a library? Is it close to a bus stop? Other amenities in the park, you know, playgrounds, dog parks, things like that. And then the score helps determine the type and scale of naturalization improvements that might happen in that park to complement the type of use and activities that are there and really help prioritize kind of staff investment. And so I think it's a really interesting tool. It's not entirely like a qualitative assessment in terms of the quality of those amenities. It's really just looks like it's, to me, and maybe someone from here for Brampton can correct me, but it looks like it's just sort of, you know, is there a playground? Yes. You know, it's not like, is the playground like, you know, does it look not so good or does it look great? So I think though that this kind of scoring system could be definitely adapted by other cities to this sort of like qualitative assessment of different parks to help understand the quality of existing park spaces and amenities and have a little bit more of a systematic approach to decision making about where to invest in terms of state of good repair or just sort of daily maintenance needs. So I think I would encourage people to check out the Eco Park plan itself and connect with someone in Brampton about the scoring system that they use.
Thanks, Jake. I'm definitely going to take your advice, especially in these times of austerity. We need to be really conscious and thoughtful about what we fund and where the dollars go. So I appreciate that. I know you two are very, very experienced in this work. So it might be hard to surprise you, but still I'm going to ask, what was the most surprising finding for you in the work on this particular report? Jake and then Adri.
I guess surprising and also like disappointing perhaps was how we're sort of seeing now like years of insufficient operating budgets I think spill over into public consciousness in a way that I haven't seen happen before the last year or so. So one stat that really stuck out to me in the report that kind of shows this is that 65% of public survey respondents this year said that their parks were well cared for. That's actually down from 78% that said so 2 years ago. So people are noticing, you know, that their parks are looking a little bit, you know, down. The other stat that I thought was really interesting around that was that 1 in 5 public respondents to the survey said that a lack of park maintenance was a barrier to them visiting parks. So that's like 20% of park visitors saying that park maintenance is a barrier to them visiting parks. And then on the city side, 2/3 of cities says they couldn't meet their park maintenance standards because of budget issues. That's a lot going on there. And it's been going on for a long time. Like we've been doing this report for 5 years. Insufficient operating budgets and maintenance issues has been at the top of that for the whole time that we've been doing this report. And I know even before we were doing this report, that was a problem for cities. So this is something we really need to turn around. It's becoming a noticeable issue in the public realm and one that is becoming a barrier to use. So I think, funding is obviously a big issue with this. Super challenging. I know there's not a lot of funding tools that cities have, especially for parks. But I think, going back to the scoring system I was just talking about, I do think, adopting some kind of qualitative scoring system can really help maybe monitor and get ahead of some of these maintenance issues. And whether that's a public scoring system so that residents can understand what's going on and where their park sits, or if it's just an internal tool even. I think something like that could really help in an era of limited funding, but hopefully also we get more funding for maintenance.
Yeah, that stat around like just how many people are noticing maintenance issues in their parks, even just compared to 2 years ago, really stood out to me as well. Like a lot of the stats that we measure each year stay relatively consistent, but that was just a huge change. So definitely worth highlighting. I think for me, a surprising finding was just this weird sort of contradiction or disconnect that we heard from city staff around how they're engaging with equity. So I'm going to read a couple stats out. And one is 83% of cities said that there's been increased dialogue about systemic inequities in their parks department since the start of the pandemic in 2020. But then 69% of cities said it can be difficult to prioritize embedding an equity lens as they're overwhelmed with managing day-to-day operations. So what that tells me is that equity is being sort of like compartmentalized as this thing that's like up here and not part of day-to-day work, or people aren't seeing it as a part of their day-to-day role. And even though there's this recognition that it's important, and I just wonder how we can overcome that. So like, I would argue that even the park work that seems like the most sort of straightforward, like old school traditional thing, like, I don't know, cutting the grass is an equity issue and should be informed by equity considerations. Like, for example, is that grass cutting informed by a maintenance strategy, like Jake was describing, that takes into account elements of quality and how they differ in different parks, and maybe prioritizes equity deserving neighborhoods? You know, like has that maintenance strategy been informed by consultation with like local First Nations to understand what their priorities are for park stewardship practices? Yeah, like even something as simple as cutting the grass is an equity issue. So I think that was surprising. And I think it also relates to sort of this very ingrained human environment binary that we have in our minds, where, you know, something like park staff often think of themselves as natural resource managers, and but even things that seem straightforwardly environmental, like tree planting, we know can be informed by equity tools that, for example, show which neighborhoods are most vulnerable to the urban heat island effect, which, you know, tends to be lower income and racialized neighborhoods. So yeah, I think there's just some work to be done to sort of integrate what we know is important into sort of day-to-day work. And also, as Jake mentioned in the presentation, like integrated across staff roles so that it's not just sort of separated out into like a one equity specialist that works in the parks department, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because we heard when you have those roles, again, I think those are important roles, but when you have them, like there's a lot of weight that falls on the shoulders of those people to do cultural translation, to educate staff, to be a public face for difficult conversations and topics. So I guess this is a lot for one single person or like maybe two person on your staff team to carry. So thinking about ways to distribute that, like Adri said, so that everybody sees equity work as part of their day-to-day role, I think is critical for moving forward.
And of course, I'm going to say this for those of you that might not know. In addition to being a proud board member on Park People, I also happen to work in a city in a country called Canada in reconciliation. So similar to equity work, right? I know of, have been the single person tasked in a city working to advance reconciliation. I'm grateful that I am no longer a single person doing that, but still, even with a small and mighty team, right? It's a lot for one folk or five folks to be tasked with. So definitely something to consider. All right. Next question. In this year's report, you interviewed a number of city staff, my colleagues from across the country. What was a moment or a story from one of those conversations you had with city staff that really resonated with you? I don't know which one of you wants to jump in first for that. A moment or a story that resonated with you in the great conversations that you had.
I'll start, AJ, unless you have a burning story you want to start with. So I spoke with one city park manager who was telling me about a natural area kind of like near a waterfront that during the pandemic became like really overused by people. Like just again, it's like one of those problems like you want people to go out in parks and then they go out into these like sensitive natural habitats and you're like, oh no, not that one though. And it included, you know, bikers who started mountain biking and people that were sort of blazing their own trails through this natural space, which, you know, obviously can happen when a lot of people are using the same space. And it was causing wildlife to be pushed out of this space and into surrounding neighborhoods, which is obviously causing conflict in those neighborhoods. But then it's not very nice for the wildlife to be pushed out of their homes. And so this person was talking to me about you know, trying different approaches, like using a public education approach, obviously, to talk about, you know, the importance of wildlife in that area and the impact of it. But they also worked or were thinking about working to formalize some of the trails that were already being created for the mountain bikers and for people walking in the park, you know, trying to close down some of them, but then actually formalizing some of the trails that had been made, and maybe thinking about a timing system where people were allowed in the park to do those types of activities versus when they weren't, you know, maybe something around allowing wildlife to move or migrate, things like that. So I thought that was a really interesting kind of like story that shows, well, it shows a lot of things in terms of just like the explosion of use during the pandemic and how that impacted, you know, wildlife in our cities. But it also shows to me, like, in terms of the solutions, that sometimes it's important to kind of recognize a use that's happening and work with the use that's already present versus like trying to like full stop, you know, stop that use. So obviously there are times when uses need to be stopped, but there are other times I think where it might be more productive to actually, you know, work with that community or that user group to kind of formalize a way for that use to continue happening in a way that is, you know, sensitive to the natural habitat or to other things that are going on. And I think about this in the context of like in Toronto, where I am, you know, this big public conversation. Well, it started as a big public conversation and then piddled out into nothing around legalizing drinking in parks. I feel like there's this kind of a good example of something like this. It's like something that everybody was doing already for many, many years. And so instead of penalizing people, let's actually, you know, formalize it and do it in a way that is, you know, not making people feel like they're sort of breaking the rules or something for an activity that is clearly happening already. So I think it's just kind of an example of maybe moments where we can work with people to kind of formalize different activities that are happening in parks so that they happen in a more sensitive way.
Mercy, thank you both. I'm conscious of time. We could maybe one or two more questions and then we'll take some that folks have been sharing in the chat and elsewhere. So
Wait.
still, yeah.
Selena, can I share mine? Because I have one that I'm like really wanting to share.
I'm so sorry.
No,
Go ahead.
That's okay. I'll be quick, but I saw the people that I wanted to talk about registered for this call. So staff from the city of North Vancouver, if you're in the audience, I'm about to give you a shout out. So maybe you can drop a little something in the chat so that other people can give you a round of applause. But one of the moments that really stood out to me from our interviews with city staff was this amazing programming led by the city of North Vancouver. They have this long-standing park stewards program, but they sort of were noticing a gap in, I guess, like who was able to access that program and who was participating in the stewardship events. And this is just as an aside, something that we've done research on at Park People. So through our Cornerstone Parks program, we did a survey of participants in stewardship programs in large urban parks across Canada and found that these participants, unsurprisingly, skew more affluent, women are overrepresented, and I think the third, you'll have to fact check me on this, but I think maybe they skew a little bit older. So anyway, just not a balanced demographic. And so the city of North Vancouver applied for this small grant. It was only a $5,000 grant with the intention of supporting like upstream health benefits by expanding sort of inclusion in their park stewards program. And they did this really in-depth work of building relationships with a whole bunch of local community organizations, including organizations that work with at-risk youth, a local shelter, partnering with some of the public libraries and their English language classes, as well as newcomer settlement organizations, and sort of like gave direct presentations to participants in these programs about like park stewardship, and then hosted tailored events for these different groups to sort of like get their foot in the door and experience park stewardship for the first time. And what was really, really cool about this is they also incorporated exit interviews at the end of these events where participants would receive an honorarium for basically chatting with the City of North Vancouver staff member about what their experience was like and like any barriers that they might have faced or ways that they could improve the program. And as a result of those conversations, they've actually like taken action, like offering free transit passes to get to stewardship events. And yeah, it's just like a really cool example of a parks department where the staff are really passionate. So, and that was a theme across all of these conversations, by the way. Like the people responsible for our city parks we're in good hands. Like very, very passionate public servants. And yeah, but I just love the depth of the work they're doing, like how focused they are on relationship building and how they're thinking about parks as a resource to maximize like social connection, health, and improve equity. So we wrote about it in the report as well. So I encourage you all to check it out.
Thanks
Sorry,
so much.
Selena. I know
Oh
we're
gosh,
rushed.
no, the story's all mine. I'm really excited that you got to share that conversation and the work that's happening in North Vancouver. And also the shout out for incredible park staff. Of course, I'm a little bit biased, but just to echo that, yeah, big hearts, big minds. They probably need 10 more hands and 30 more hours in the week to do things that they want to do. Okay, we'll do maybe one more question and then we'll take some questions from, there's of course too many questions from the group that we won't be able to get to, but we'll try and get to some. But one more question for the two of you. What's one key thing that you hope decision makers take away from the report? And also, what about community members? Is there something that you want decision makers to take away? And what do you want community to know from this report? I know, Jake, if you wanted to start us off, or Adrian.
Sure. Yeah, and I also just wanted to echo like what Adri said about being able to talk to all these different park managers and park staff from across the country. Like I left every conversation like really inspired. So yeah, like Adri said, we're in good hands. Park people are the best people, as I don't know, I've found. In terms of yeah, taking away decision makers, I think yeah, I think for me it's got to be like to really focus on quality issues and to kind of maybe even take that like back to the basics a little bit. So like just looking at like the kind of basic amenities that we need in parks in order for them to be comfortable, accessible places for everyone. You know, washrooms that work and are open at the times people actually need to go, including in the winter. Believe it or not, people do need to go in the winter. Drinking water, plentiful and accessible seating, you know, that allows people to sit and maybe even lie down if they need to. Shade in parks for people to get out of the elements. It's amazing to me how many parks don't have these elements in them. They're really the basic things to make people feel safe and comfortable and welcome. And I think they can go a really, really long way if we kind of just do like an inventory of our park system and see like which ones of them have these in good working order, and kind of just start there. So that's one sort of key thing I hope people take away, is that those basics and that issue of quality really does matter. And then I think for community members, it's really about like that your voice matters. You know, we heard from so many city staff who told us that it's so important for them to hear from community members and for community members to speak up about issues, especially to say the things that city staff can't say themselves, like in the public, about you know, needing more funding for parks, or speaking up about maintenance issues, or you know, whatever it is. So not necessarily focusing in on the specific things that are happening in your own local park, although that may be part of it, but thinking a little bit more broader about your park system itself, and advocating at City Hall for more funding and for better parks for your city or your neighborhood as a whole, like that kind of stuff actually really does have an impact.
Yeah, for me, I think for decision makers, like one of the things that was really exciting with the report is we sort of asked this question around whether parks departments were seeing a role for the park sector in relation to all of these other systemic issues, like climate change, houselessness, like all of the most like pressing urban issues that we think about. And there's recognition, I think, that parks intersect with all of these different arenas, but I think what we need now is some movement towards creating collaboration structures and partnership models that allow us to address these like very complex issues in sort of a comprehensive, like cross-sectoral way. And so there's some examples of this in the report case studies, but yeah, I think just like really decision makers, like I would just really like to see holistic sort of like de-siloed approaches to addressing some of these complex challenges that show up in parks, and also seeing parks as an avenue to implement solutions to things that don't seem park related on the surface. Like parks can do so much if we invest in them. And then in terms of community members, like one of the stats that we didn't touch on in the presentation, but that we've asked in the public survey for the past couple of years is around encampments. We ask like whether the presence of encampments impacts people's personal use of parks. And what we find each year is that the majority of people say no, but I don't think that information makes its way to cities who are on the end of receiving like lots of complaints from the public about encampments. Like you often just hear the complaints, you don't hear the support or the positives. So I guess my advice for community members would be to like, maybe take an empathetic lens to like evaluating how your local park is being used, and try and voice your support for things that are working well or things that you care about, like when you can. Not like, don't just call 311 when you have a complaint is basically like the gist of what I'm trying to say, because yeah, just to balance things out a little bit more.
Awesome. Thank you both. I want to keep asking questions and just hear all of your perspectives, but there's been a huge number of questions that have come through the Q&A as well as the chat, and I'm going to apologize to everybody right now that there is no way that we have enough time to get to all of them. A few of us have been trying to answer them by typing, and we do have time for a couple right now. But I apologize that we won't get to everyone's questions. We are capturing the chat and the questions though, so don't worry. What you're sharing with us will not be lost. Park People is collecting this, and it'll be fuel for further consideration, conversations, quotes, and work. All right, so one of the first questions that came in, there's a bit of context, so just bear with me, please, Jake and Adri. High operational costs and crumbling park amenities seems a big issue. You definitely highlighted that in the report and this webinar. Yet we continue to create master plans that double down on park infrastructure in an attempt to accommodate more people, thus creating even more future operational costs. Has much work been done to determine if we are overbuilding parks as places to put outdoor furniture, and if we should look more at sustainable ways to accommodate people?
Interesting question. I think most of the planning work that is done around parks uses projections related to population growth and developments that are in the pipeline, and so I don't think plans that are being created that forecast the number of parks that we need for folks are, I don't think we're at risk of overbuilding in many cities. Even within those plans, often cities are acknowledging that they aren't going to be able to hit the targets that they have set for themselves around hectares of parkland per people. So I don't think it's about overbuilding, but I do think, as I sort of mentioned before earlier, that that we do need to shift our focus a little bit to look at existing spaces more so than I think we have in the past, to understand whether the parks and the inventory of public space that we have. What I mean by that is not necessarily just parks, but I'm talking about streets, laneways, hydro corridors, schoolyards, you know, all of the public spaces that we use, whether those are working, for lack of a better word, optimally. You know, are we using all of the public space we already have in our inventory to its greatest potential? I think often we're not, actually, and that might be because of maintenance issues and other issues. And so access issues, for instance, or maybe people don't even know they're allowed to go there. So I think that there's a lot of work that cities can do to kind of look a little bit inwardly at the same time as they're looking at building outwardly and building more new parks, to make sure that the ones they have are kind of working the best they can and are taking advantage of all the spaces that they have.
One small addition that I would make is where my mind went immediately in hearing that question is one of the things we didn't get a chance to write up in the report, but it was a common theme that we noticed based on our conversations, was just how much municipal sort of organizational structures can impact the way park work happens. So we heard from some cities that like even something as simple as the park maintenance folks working in the same building as the park planners can like really help them sort of come up with, like, ensure that new capital infrastructure is sort of informed by the expertise of the folks who are going to be ultimately responsible for maintaining it years down the road. So yeah, it was too big of a topic to cover in this year's report, but I am very fascinated by how these different sort of structures of parks departments and cities like come with different pros and cons, particularly as it relates to collaboration between planners and maintenance folks.
Some future work there. Thank you, Idri. We had a question asking for a few words about the main geographical differences in the results that you saw through the conversations and the research you did for this report.
Go ahead, Adrian. No, I was just trying to think of the survey results and whether they've been sliced up geographically. I know that's something that we've done in the past, so I don't know if that work has been done yet. So I wasn't sure.
Yeah, just like off the top of my mind, I think like we see the biggest differences between different city sizes. The exception to that being like Ontario this year, because of some of the provincial legislative changes, had like a very unique policy context. So we saw a lot of shared challenges happening in Ontario. I don't know, like Jake, do you want to touch briefly on the Ontario situation?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly. It's a sort of a hornet's nest of changes or whatever, and it seems to change all the time. But yeah, just at the basics, the provincial government sort of changed a lot of the formulas and took away some of the tools that cities had to get parkland funding and space through the development system. And there was a lot of pushback. We actually have a great interview with Michelle Robbie from the city of Richmond Hill about the work that she did to sort of like build a coalition of other municipal park staff to advocate on behalf of like this sort of consortium of municipalities to get some better systems put in place. So yeah, that's a very unique challenge to Ontario because it's going to reduce, according to the municipal planners that we spoke with, reduce the amount of parkland that cities will be able to get through the development process over the next few years, which they say could lead to inequities between neighborhoods constructed from now on having less parkland per capita than neighborhoods that have been constructed historically under the previous system. So that's one definite geographic difference. But like Adrian said, I think it's more about sizes, and I know there is some of those differences pointed out in the report that cities over 500,000, you know, have these types of sort of concerns, and smaller cities and mid-tier cities have sometimes some different stats and concerns related to them. But honestly, like one of the major things that came out of these conversations was just how many shared challenges there are. It doesn't matter whether you're a city of 1 million or a city of 100,000, like people were dealing with a lot of the same stuff, different scales, but very similar.
Okay, it's hard to pick. There's so many great questions. This will be, I think that I'm looking at time, that the last question. was related to diverse voices included in the research. And so if you could speak a little bit to, how, if, and how diverse voices were included in the research, and was there a community-based approach taken in the research process?
I would say this year, like honestly, we changed our methodology to focus on park professionals, like through our approach of like interviewing municipal staff. And to be totally honest, I think there is a lack of diversity in these staff roles. Like I don't think we heard from the widest range of voices, and I think that's a reflection, unfortunately, of the sector. Yeah, like I don't know, Jake, if you have any other thoughts on that, but I think we try and like surface these issues, but for sure, like a drawback of the approach that we took this year is that it wasn't, yeah, we didn't get to hear from the most diverse sort of like community voices, but which is something that we've really done in previous years of the report. But it was an intentional focus this year because we were trying to like get behind the scenes with park staff and understand like what exactly are the barriers to implementing some of this more like progressive work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add there except for that it was a different approach that we took this year, and that in past years we cast like a very wide net and had really interesting and dynamic conversations with like activists and advocates and nonprofit staff and city staff, and really sought out different perspectives. And as Adri said, this year we really wanted to try to get at the park managers and the top decision makers in parks to kind of have a little bit of a different flavor to the report this year. So the reader will be able to tell us whether that was a well-taken approach or not.
So that's also the brilliance of doing a report annually. So you have, it won't be too long until you're starting the next report, but you've got this opportunity to explore differently and different voices. You could reach out and include different voices next year than you did this year, and of course different than last year. So part of the brilliance of this ongoing work that Park People does, thanks to experts like yourselves, Adri and Jake. So thank you so much for producing this amazing piece of work. Also, an extended thank you to all city staff and park enthusiasts who shared their thoughts and wisdoms and stories to help Jake and Adri create this report and share it with us and the world. Would also really like to extend big thank you, Kuchi Marcy, to the Weston Family Foundation for their leadership, and to the Mahari and Alberta Real Estate Foundation for their support in this work. It takes a lot of us to pull these things together and birth them into the world so that we can have the wisdom and apply it. So thanks so much, everyone. To the attendees, last but certainly not least. If you want, in closing, to let us know how you're feeling right now as we end our time together. Thank you so much for being part of today. We really appreciate it. Of course, if you want to know more about the amazing organization that is Park People, be sure to sign up for our newsletter. The link should be in the chat. And I really, really hope you enjoy the rest of your day. It is beautiful here in Port Credit, Mississauga, Ontario. So hopefully it is lovely where you are, and you can get outside to one of your local parks and enjoy this day. Marcy, take care.